Some idiot trying to plow the street even though the street is clear. Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. I played it on the PC via Steam. Theoretically, it's available on the Xbox via backwards compatibility. It's currently not available for some reason, but was, so if you have it. But it is also available on the original Xbox and PS2 if you have those. So let's get into it. You play as, well, a Prince of Persia. They never actually give you his name throughout the game, which is kind of an interesting thing. But to put it simply, you and your father team up with the vizier of another country, and, well, they, attack him secretly. And in the process, they loot the palace. You trying to prove your worth, you steal this artifact called the Dagger of Time. And while looting the rest of the treasures, you find the Hourglass of Time when you take them to the Maharaja to show off how dope you guys are and, establish your alliance. Well, the prince is tricked into opening the Sands of Time, and it creates monsters, and, it just fucks up a bunch of stuff, basically. And I really enjoy the story in this game. I really like where the characters go. I like the character growth, although I will say there are some times where there's some poor writing. Not necessarily in how the story goes, but in the dialogue. There are times where the prince and Farah, who is a princess that you team up with, they'll have this really good dialogue, but then when the prince is away from her, he says some shit, and you're like, that just doesn't match up with the tone you had like 5 seconds ago. But overall, I enjoy the story, I enjoy where it goes, I enjoy the character growth. Now, as for the audio, I really like the music in this game. I think the music really fits with, what's going on at all times. The soundtrack has a Mid-Eastern vibe throughout, but then there are times where it's like really action-oriented and you get some guitar mixed with that Middle Eastern vibe, and it just works. As for the sound effects, given when this game was released, they are a bit limited, but I do think they actually provide a good variety, and overall the quality is good. And the voiceover work is not flawless, but it is good. Some of it is a little over the top, and I do think it works, but at the same time it does feel a little cheesy. I did run into an issue with the audio though, where the mixing seems a little off. Cutscenes, everything's fine, you can hear everyone very clearly, but during gameplay, you can't necessarily hear your character or Farah. Now, I threw on some headphones, and I guess they have like a 3D audio thing, so it helped. But even then, there were a few times where it was a bit muted. Now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a third-person action, not quite parkour, but sort of-ish game. What I mean by that is there is a lot of traversal in this game. A lot of the puzzles are based on traversal. Running on walls far further than any human really could, running up walls, jumping from walls to pillars, and like climbing around pillars and swinging on things and balance beams and all of that stuff. The combat uses that traversal element as well, like you can step on an enemy, jump over them, hit them in the back, you can jump on a wall and jump over an enemy to hit them, or launch off a wall into them. The prince will flip around depending on where you're aiming to hit. It's really actually well done, but I will say there are times early on, and a lot of my footage is from the early on stuff, where you end up using the same trick over and over, so when you are introduced to harder enemies, it feels like the difficulty has ramped up excessively, when in reality they do provide you with the tools you need, they just don't hammer home that you need them throughout the game. A lot of the earlier enemies you can defeat without ever blocking once, you can defeat without rewinding time, which I need to get into that in a moment. But then you've fought those scrub enemies and suddenly they introduce the higher level enemies, and you can't use the same acrobatic moves that you were using on the scrubs, and they don't really get you prepared for that. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, you can rewind time. You have a limited amount of time you can rewind, but say you die because you failed on a traversal, say you died in combat or took some hits that you didn't want to take, you can reverse time. But that being said, in combat, the enemy then may do a different move than you thought they were going to do. That move that they hit you with and you want to reverse away from, well, they may choose a different move instead. So there is a bit of variety there. But beyond that, the Dagger of Time gives you other abilities as well, like you can slow time, you can do this super move where everybody else slows down and you like warp between them and attack them. There are also upgrades in this game. You can find secret areas where you can upgrade your health. You find these little things that you jam the Dagger of Time in that will give you more time control, basically. Also, absorbing the Sands of Time from your enemies will give you more special ability slots. But the one gameplay thing I do need to address, and it's a huge problem in this game, it's the camera. The camera is your greatest enemy in this game, whether it's in combat or running around. There are times in combat where the camera will just bounce around a lot, and it makes it very hard to target the enemies you want to target. But then also when you're doing traversal outside of combat, there are times where you can't move the camera in a way that makes it easy to move in the direction you need to so you don't fall off a ledge. Now let's get into the controls, and the first thing I'm going to say, I do think that this plays better with a controller. Not that I used a controller this time around, but I played the game in the past on a controller. I went through keyboard and mouse this time around, and I just feel like you have a little bit more control with the controller. I think it works better, specifically for movement. The camera, no matter what, is your enemy, but movement-wise, I think it's a little easier to adapt to with a controller than it is keyboard and mouse. That being said, I do think it responds well, and I didn't have any issues. I think the mapping works well. And lastly, the visuals. It's an Xbox game. Like an original Xbox and PS2 era game, it's not the most beautiful thing you are going to see. The amount of detail in the world is lacking, and that is, very obvious. But what they did do is give it a almost cartoony design. Like, none of the people are hyper realistic. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, I think that benefits this game due to the age. Now, while there isn't an insane amount of detail in the world, I do think there are some neat, subtle little details for the time, like the movement of curtains, the movement of your character's hair. Things like that may sound silly, but the flowy nature of that actually worked really well considering the time this game was released. And I also just like the overall visual style. I like the design of the levels and the world. While it doesn't necessarily make sense for some of these objects to be there for you to climb on and run along, I do think it fits better in the world, and it feels like they actually tried to build a world around those rather than just have them there and then the rest of the world feels like just set dressing. And I also just think overall the world they built is pretty cool looking. I think the character and creature designs are really well done. I like the animation for the movements, for the running on the walls, for the combat, all of that. I think overall, visually, it is a good looking game, just from a stylistic perspective. But obviously the graphics are old and, it's very noticeable. Now, unfortunately, there were a couple of smaller graphical issues, or just issues in general. I did have some frame rate problems in a couple of areas, oddly enough. It wasn't everywhere, so it wasn't a huge drag. But I did run into an area where I was in one of the, health areas, health shrine things, where my character really just wouldn't walk up the thing for some reason. Eventually, they got up there on their own. I kind of stopped doing things, but it was obnoxious. So to wrap this up, it's not a super long game, it's also not a super expensive game. If you have Steam, I think it's absolutely worth the money. I had a lot of fun going back and replaying this game. It's been a long time, but I very much enjoyed it. I will add the addendum, and I think I made it clear throughout the rest of the review, that there are some frustrating elements in this game. But overall, I had a good time. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, have you played Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time? Or even the original Prince of Persia long before this, which I have not played, and quite frankly, it doesn't look that enjoyable to me. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, and if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.